Hello and welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast. I'm Morag. Join me each week in conversation with leading permaculture-related and ecological educators, thinkers, activists, authors, designers and practitioners to explore the kind of thinking and action we need to navigate a positive and regenerative way forward, to myceliate possibilities and share ideas of what a thriving one planet way of life could look like. My guests offer voices of clarity and common sense. I'm so delighted to be sharing this episode with you. I'm speaking with my dear friend and collaborator, the amazing Christie Wilson. Christie is a clinical psychotherapist, climate activist, and facilitator working with people at the front line of the climate emergency. She wrote the Regen 101 program for Global XR and has recently co-authored and published an article on climate-aware counselling. She develops and facilitates professional development workshops to explore the eco-psychosocial experience of engaging with climate change and climate justice. She hosts events with Psychology for Safe Climate, organises for Extinction Rebellion Global Support, and serves on the boards of the Anthropocene Transition Network and the Green Law Network. Together, Christie and I created a permaculture series of conversations with Global XR that continue to ripple out. In this conversation, we touch deeply on how it feels to be alive today, knowing what's going on around us and finding the courage to continue to show up and simultaneously taking care of ourselves. Let me begin first, though, by acknowledging that I'm recording this episode from my hand-built solar-powered studio here on beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country, and I'm surrounded here by my permaculture design gardens in a permaculture eco-village. The Sense Making in a Changing World podcast is a project of the Permaculture Education Institute. We teach permaculture design, permaculture teachers, and permaculture livelihood skills online to people on 6 continents, who in turn localise and enrich it and find appropriate ways to apply the planet care ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share wherever they are. Before we jump in, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to Sense Making the Changing World podcast on your favourite app, and please do leave us a 5-star review and a lovely comment, because it really does help the bots find this little show. All right, well, let's turn now to the conversation with Christie Wilson. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Christie. It's such a delight that we've actually finally found this moment to sit down together and have a chat. It's been a long time coming.
It has, Morag, yeah.
There's so many things that I'd love to talk with you about: the work that you're doing, the intersection of that with permaculture, your work over the years as an eco-activist. But we could begin with just what opened the doors for you in your mind to be so present in this space of regenerative culture and eco-activism. What cracked open that world for you?
I guess this is part of like something that I have been working on with people in practice and with groups, around regenerative futures, but also like the impacts from climate, ecological and biodiversity loss. And it is part of my own process. And, I think storytelling our ecological stories that form our identity is a really big part of that. It's a really big part of understanding how intricately connected we are to everything. And therefore, if the planet's disrupted, so will we be. And so like early on, I was part of to start with a little story, I was part of the mass migration from the western suburbs in Sydney to the Central Coast in the 70s. We moved to a little sort of bush shack across the road from the beach. And so that was very like early years, like 3-4 years old, and sort of we ran around in bare feet and trod on bindies. And
what was that mass migration? What?
Yeah, it was just like whole lots of people moved from Western Sydney up to the Central Coast earlier, and I think that was earlier on during the war and depression time. There was a massive big tent city up at Toukley, so a lot of my parents' parents either were part of that tent city and knew about the area. It was abundant, full of fish, and there was a lot of food grown up here during the wartime, citrus farms and etc. So people even though we're living in a tent city and it was during Depression, actually had access to fresh produce and was sharing. And I think that stayed in that lifestyle near the ocean, and the lake stayed in the minds of the people that lived there, and then their children coming up on holidays, and so became part of a big culture move from Western Sydney at one point, in the early 70s, late 60s.
What about that, though, that understanding where you were in this place of, the need to care for it? Because you can grow up in a place, a beautiful place, but not necessarily have a sense of it or a sense of it changing. What changed that awoke you to feeling like the need to care so much more deeply, to protect it and to stand up and speak up and to actually become an activist?
Yeah, I guess I naturally was drawn to caring for animals. Like everything that was injured, I would bring home, and my parents would be like, oh. And because living across the road from the ocean, it was a place called Blue Lagoon, and it looked like Blue Lagoon. So we had fresh water coming down from the mountain that we could drink. Whale migration, which is this time of year now, we'd swim around and there'd be dolphins, and we'd be fishing, and so much abundant wildlife. And I guess because we were so young with my brother and sister, we didn't feel separate. Like we kind of grew. And then we went to a bush school, and our bush school was like a demountable school that was cleared, rough, and it was freezing in the winter and hot in the summer. And I was very, very lucky to have had an Aboriginal teacher early on. And so we got to do bark paintings, and encouraged into sort of like a paperbark swamp forest that surrounded the school. And we did grow with that. We were kind of a motley crew, ride motorbikes and, roller skates down hills. And it was just such a wild, beautiful way of living. And I definitely felt like I grew with that as we got older, because it was like to get into any shopping centre, it was like nearly an hour trip on a bumpy old red bus on a dirt road. And so when we heard this shopping centre was coming called Bay Village, we were all quite excited until the bulldozers arrived and literally wiped out our bushland around our school within a week. So it went from this incredible swampy paperbark place that we'd grown with, and we knew who lived in there with us, and there was always a pair of or many eyes on us, and we knew which places to tread and not. And going to seeing that place of just like desecrated dirt with rubbish left and some bulldozers, and then they gated it. We climbed over it, and I remember watching the reactions from everybody, and someone rocking back and forward, just in this wanting to just scream with grief, and others really angry. And for me, I just sort of stood there, and I really felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I was so sick. And then I started to think, no, if we leave this, it knows what to do. Like there was this, and I think that was the first moment that I really embodied the potential of regeneration. Like I knew the place wouldn't come back exactly looking the same, but it would be the same, like it would come back. And that's from that time on, I think that formed a very deep somatic embodied understanding of the power of regeneration. And it did form my career, moving, like I trained as a naturopath and homeopath before going into psychotherapy and Gestalt psychotherapy, and really looking at that mind, body, earth connection in the meaning of healing as a career moving forward. But also, I guess, having our Aboriginal teacher, and again in high school, who I'm still in relationship here, and then my brother marrying into a sort of a proud Yolngu family and having Aboriginal children and being involved in some Indigenous rights activism. Oh, I just want to take a breath, thinking about all of that, like to do that kind of activism. There was so much violence involved, and from the police, so much injustice. And then looking at how people were living in such harmony in their homes, and with such deep knowledge of their totems and understanding of medicine. There was such a disparity between, a system that I was living in as a white identified child, and then this system that was so full of potential to share this knowledge and willing to, and being so oppressed. And there's something always stayed with me around the oppression of something So anything really with so much potential and to evolve, like human beings and the land and all of us together. I guess there's a lot more to say there, but stay with that.
So your work you were talking about that you began as a naturopath, and that deep connection of place and medicine and community. You do a lot of work now helping people with eco-grief. I wonder whether you could just reflect on what you see as the state of eco-grief now. I think as you were speaking about that first experience, I feel like there's those kind of moments in many of us, whether it be at a large scale loss of an area like that, or a little, a special tree that gets chopped down in next door neighbours if you're in a suburban backyard. Or I remember my area where I grew up was one of the, it was on the outskirts of Melbourne, and when I first moved there was a few houses up and down the streets, but the kids kind of ran wild, a bit like you. So we knew where all the secret spots were, and there were just the forest around us, the creek down the bottom. We were racing through the streets free until, parents called us in at night time.
Sure.
And gradually that filled in, and it just became busier and busier. The next generation of children to grow up in that street became caged. Yeah. They weren't allowed out in the street. The loss of the forest, the loss of the rivers, the loss of the sense of connection with place. To me, it feels like it's there in all of us somewhere, whether we recognize it or not. And I wonder whether you could speak to that a bit.
Absolutely. With the Regen 101 program that I sort of developed for Extinction Rebellion, and it was on earth emotions, and it was, after a long discussion I had with Glenn Albrecht just before the book came out. And I wondered how we could unpack earth emotions, ecological grief, eco-anxiety, like terror, trauma, fury. And I remembered all those emotions that came up when our bush was cleared. From a personal level, I've always sort of tried to not work with people with something that I haven't actually embedded deeply into my own life. And coming from that sort of naturopathic background, we were sort of the first or the last group of naturopaths to even have the training before it went into universities in Australia. And, before that, it was osteopathy and homeopathy and a lot of the body work, and very somatically based, and the herbal medicine, the nutrition, and energetic medicine, and putting all that together. And then it went in a little bit like we were seeing in the healing justice movement. It went into the universities, even training as a naturopath changed, it changed out of that kind of real permaculture deep roots, and people with lineages of knowledge of teaching the next generation into university-based training as well. I saw that as a really big part of a colonization of something that should be available to all of us. And as far as the grief goes, I lost a family member, in my early 20s, a very close family member. And the grief that I went into actually dropped me so deeply into ecological grief, because nature or the natural world had been my family as well. And so going through that kind of loss and in that grief, I started, I guess, to really more than ever wake up to how my natural world family members were suffering at the hand of people. That was when I first awakened to the grief that had been there for me already around what was happening on a planetary scale, really. And I think that's happened to a lot of people. They've actually been through some kind of a loss, whether it's been in a relationship or a natural landscape that they love, or a loss of a loved one, a pet, and that's kind of a trigger for people, because people lean into nature, don't they? They get nature to embrace them when they're feeling grief or feeling other big emotions and need that extra support. It's a place that we often go to for our healing anyway. And so I think this is kind of something that's happened, and I noticed on a global scale, and I noticed that during the Regen 101 when we asked about solastalgia, like when you're feeling like the place where you grew up is moving away from you. A known place is looked differently, like the weather patterns moving south, or having a even if you grew up, like it doesn't matter if you grew up in wild nature or in an urban landscape or a desert, it's just having something that's familiar to you. I guess it's familiar as a family member, like a tree, for example, on a street, and having that cut down, and that not only changing the landscape, but it's a part of your own ecological story that's being so deeply impacted. So one of the ways that I've been working with people that is getting some great success, or at least relief for people, and to help move forward into some kind of, I don't want to say the word resilience, I just want to say meaning making, maybe is a better word about what's happening, and then finding sort of like their place in what they would like to do about it, is to unpack your own ecological stories, to think about the places for some people where they grew up. It's because some people grew up in multiple places, they moved around all over the globe. Others, stayed in one place their entire life. But there's always these moments of an ecological story. And if you put all those stories together, it sort of forms your ecological identity. And then for you and I, we know that after studying, with Nora Bateson and doing the warm data work, we know that there's nested systems. We know that things are so interconnected. And so our stories merge with the next system. So it might be our inner story, our inner world, and then the place where we grew, and then the place where we grew, how that's connected maybe to other places, and eventually goes out planetary and global. And if we're quite sensitive to our stories, or if we spend time in group unpacking these stories, storytelling, yarning, like Australian First People would call it, or if we draw it, dance it, art it, some form, garden it, we don't have to go into just journaling or talking about it. There's other ways to somatically express this, and it can be really cathartic and make room. It's like processing something through your body to bring it of service to your soul journey, or to something that you're here to do, that even if you're sitting in the middle of a storm, it's quite centering to know that that's what you're here for, and that's what your soul's calling you to do. And it's born out of grief sometimes, or, and grief comfortably sits under anger, and comfortably sits under so many other emotions, especially at this time in the world.
The question that I wanted to ask you around this is, how is it that you've found the best way to support people who are feeling so deeply about this, and possibly feeling enormous amounts of even futility about the future? What have you seen are ways to support people who are in that state?
Underneath all of that, as a foundation, was I needed to find a way to support myself to do that work. And so we know that, so many things happened in 2018. It was a really, really big year. And late 2017, I think I went out wanting to move out of my own grief. I went to a lecture by the late Professor Will Stephan out at the Western Sydney University, and I met Dr. Kim Liu and Sally Gillespie and the Anthropocene Transition Network, and went into a dialogue group with, some of the members from the Anthropocene Transition with Sally, and still a member of that. And it was such a support to be in a group, and we were just talking about what the Anthropocene meant, and sort of what all of this meant. And so at that time, it was just prior to Extinction Rebellion forming in Australia. And early on, I went out to the Narara Eco Village, where Extinction Rebellion had, were having their second sort of meeting. And I went out and I thought, oh, this is it. I mean, I just felt like I had to take action. I had to be part of something that was just pushing an emergent edge, because I just felt, not only did that feel cathartic, but I just felt like, this is just calling to me. And then when we set up the Regenerative Culture Working Group in Sydney, and this is prior to the first rebellion that was in Sydney, and prior to the bushfires. And, there was a sort of a feeling prior to the bushfires. There was just this feeling coming, and I was trying to understand what at the time, regenerative culture, later on we renamed it, regenerative cultures, and trying to think, what does that actually mean? Like, what does it mean? Like, I don't know how to define this. And so I started writing a little sort of a workshop, and Glenn Albrecht came down and supported, and because we started with earth emotions, and then we looked at sort of intersectionality, communities of care, and the first one was very teaching, and it was a big lesson learnt, because we did take this workshop then to the Blue Mountains and the Central Coast and Hobart and Launceston and Melbourne and Brisbane and the ACT. Like, we really took it to many different contexts, and what we found was the meaning of regenerative cultures. We kept asking, what does it mean? Like, we'd sort of ask, and we realised that what we were doing was creating a cultural container for people to tell us what regenerative cultures meant for them. And then we started hearing a pattern emerging. And so the workshop, during the bushfires, we were writing this little PDF booklet to go with the workshop, and we nearly stopped doing it because, everyone was being evacuated, and the grief was so full on from so much loss. Here on the Central Coast, we were covered in smoke like many other places. We were not on fire, but bracing for it, and all the little bats, the pollinators, were dropping out of the sky, and, it was so heartbreaking, for everybody around the country and the world to hear the loss. And for the people directly impacted, like, the grief was so full on. We decided, no matter what, we're going to finish this booklet, because we believe now that regenerative cultures and regenerative futures is the most important thing we could be doing on the planet right now. One of the young activists in Hong Kong, I was listening to her, she was one of the main organisers. She said she had a moment, and she was standing there, and she thought, like, we're up against this, and there's all this oppression and violence. What would I do if we all suddenly put everything down? What would be the next step? And she couldn't answer it. She just, this was on a webinar she was on, and that was her starting to think about, like, the meaning of regenerative futures. How are we going to be next after we, really do this very important nonviolent direct action? And that really stayed with me, that thought as well, as like, what are we creating? How are we evolving, like the consciousness of everything, so we don't suddenly do all this action and get the political change, and then what? We go back into battle with each other because we haven't done the inner work, the mindset work, the tending, the obligation work to the places and spaces where we live and to each other. So moving back into that workshop, because we had the fires, so that changed the vulnerability and the delicacy and the deep sharing of grief that came into the workshop. And during the fires, we ran one in Sydney. It was huge, like, people coming in and for the first time understanding what communal grieving was. That it was big stuff. And also at the People's Assembly in Canberra, where everyone went shoulder to shoulder around and was calling out for action on climate, while Canberra was actually on fire. And we facilitated an animal mourning, a warm data lab as well, and an animal mourning sort of ceremony, and people came with their animals and photos of animals. And at the time, we knew what the ash meant. And also in the warm data lab, mid-warm data lab, smoke was pouring into the room, and so we sort of stopped and acknowledged what was actually being lost at the time. So based on that experience, during COVID, we pivoted online with this workshop, and then we started working really with people around Australia, and the team that I was working with in the global support in Extinction Rebellion Regenerative Cultures Working Group. I was teamed up with a young woman from Hawaii and India and the UK. And so we kind of had this sort of this team, and we transformed this 2-day workshop into an online offering, which was, you know, like at that time, it was the, you know, the new world of Zoom was happening. And but what we did find was everyone was inside, so people were really grieving so much about the world, and so a lot of people came to these workshops. You know, sometimes we were up to 90 people, and we would have to shift it around into more of a webinar and style. And yeah, so unpacking all these emotions, people were, you know, like we had groups from Africa, and we have groups from Korea, and we have groups from just, you name it, on the world coming together and talking about what it meant. And it was so amazing to hear people doing these deep listening with each other around what was happening in their context, what regenerative cultures meant in their context, what it meant to be in relationship with place and space in their context, and doing sort of that cross-cultural, cross-pollination of learning with deep respect and deep listening. And something magic happened each and every time, and still does in the room when that happens. And some of the words that were named, like we did it very much about, let's have a shared meaning of a word, like terra fury, and that, you know, was coined by Glenn Albrecht again. And this one, like within the activist space, was really, really popular. Like people were like, oh, finally. They were so angry at what was happening politically, so angry at what is happening environmentally, with biodiversity, with social justice issues all happening at once. People were so angry, and some people like that led to burnout, others like to acting like quite erratic with rage. And when people in the room and sort of talking about, hey, this is protective anger, this is like a mama bear, this is like you feeling so protective and so just insulted by the injustice of what's happening, and no wonder you're so angry and full of rage. So to have that named, and then to have a place to go, all right, now let's talk about what we can do about it, and sort of process that and transform that into non-violent direct action, or into like a change in their life. You know, I had a beautiful woman, I love to use her as an example, and I have permission, but we will call her Ellen, say. She lives in a wheelchair and is from an affluent area, and her way of dealing with everything was to not mow her front lawn, which was a big no-no in where she lived. And she said, I'm creating a bee farm, and she got the greatest delight in sitting out there being a disruptor on that level, which was a huge thing for her. And it was her contribution to being, you know, like non-violent direct action, that this was hers. And others, you know, like came into the Regen 101 workshop because they were really curious around XR and didn't want to go in through the other ways. They didn't go to a Heading for Extinction talk. They kind of were interested in the regenerative culture aspect. But from there went straight into Heading for Extinction talk, and straight into an NVDA training, non-violent direct action training, and straight to the frontline doing, you know, non-violent direct action. And with the underpinnings and with the foundation of regenerative cultures and non-violence, and thinking about what am I here at the front line for, and how do I go through the regenerative action cycle and take care of myself and others as we do it. So
what were those patterns that you heard people talking about when you were asking the question about what are regenerative cultures and what does it look like and where are we heading? What are we calling for?
Yeah, look, it was so interesting. It went from people would recognise regenerative cultures as maybe they'd become from a regenerative agricultural background, permaculture background. Others were coming in from doing mindful self-compassion kind of work, or Buddhism, or the inner kind of transformational work, and saying, you know, like we need to work on the inner and with each other. Others were going, you know, like it means to me to live, you know, within the natural systems, and come back into natural cycles of living, and therefore living like that, and going off and sort of caring for a piece of land. For other people, it meant, I guess, respectfully stepping forward into the work of decolonisation and anti-oppression, and listening to the wisdom of First Nations people, and wanting to sort of more understand Indigenous cosmology. Other people were going for a regenerative cultures aspect, like really looking at the area of burnout and how to look after activists on the field. So there was what was centre to all of it when we asked about self-care was that self-care is really impossible without community care in some way. Like we can do these things of self-care that we don't want to talk, we don't want to say it's like rubbing essential oil on you and doing yoga. Like that is a form of self-care, but how that changes you and how you sort of bring your potential into a community is, like again, coming back to liminal space or nested systems. We know from warm data, thinking through how you do your self-care and how that's connected to community care or family care, and the first system being inside of your body, taking care of that family and that system, and then moving that out into family and community and wider. So there was a very continuous theme of understanding, firstly, how they'd neglected self-care as an activist, and then engaging in self-care brought them into much deeper community care and thinking into regenerative futures or acting on creating regenerative futures.
I wanted just to circle back to something else you were talking about, these community shared grieving spaces or shared conversational spaces where people feel they can bring up these types of feelings and work through them together. Now, you are a trained psychotherapist. If someone in the community was wanting to start up a circle like this, what would you recommend that they do? I mean, there's that feeling of, well, it might actually, if you lift the lid on this, I might not know what to do with it. How would you approach that?
Absolutely. And let's firstly acknowledge lifting the lid on pent or oppressed grief from no other reason than growing up in primarily a Western culture where we're not taught to do communal grieving. And, you see it at the celebration of someone's end of life. There's people sitting often in churches holding on for grim death to all of their emotions, and hearing this beautiful music and looking at pictures. And I've often felt like going through, like sitting in those spaces and places for the people I love. It's so cruel. And then when there's someone says something funny, there's a moment of everyone's like, it's a great relief, when we can talk about the person. And so, we really haven't been taught to be in community to do grieving. And I so appreciate being in community where there's wailing and where there's because when someone or something that you love either passes over or transform in a different shape, I think a natural response is to make sounds and to do body movements, and we just haven't had much exposure to that kind of community grieving. So firstly, yes, we want to take care that is true and that is real, and so taking care of yourself to step gently into what, as much as or little as you want to share. Grief is grief. It's one person's grief. It's not measurable. You hear stories and some people have been through the most unimaginable situations and experiences in life. So emotional methodologies are things like the Good Grief Network 10-step process, climate cafes, the Regen 101 program, talking circles, yarning circles. These are things where people are coming together and unpacking the work that reconnects, obviously, with Joanna Macy and Active Hope. We've been doing these for the last 5 years in groups of people, and some people have been doing the work for a bit longer and can go a little bit deeper. Other times people can come in and they're just being exposed to doing this kind of work, and with good facilitation, it can be held really safely so that people can, like I said, give as much or as little as they want of their grief process. It doesn't mean that going out on your own and being held by the ground, doing your own wailing or doing your own spiritual process, whatever that is, isn't really helpful as well. It's just that doing this community stuff as well as your individual stuff. And obviously, sometimes talking to a person that you feel like you really trust about this grief process, or actually going and getting professional help, like for some others, it's all really helpful. But these community grieving processes are really showing to be one of the number one helpful things during the climate and ecological crisis.
I was just talking with John Seed recently, and he was mentioning how he's never seen such a growing interest in the Council of All Beings, for example, the deep ecology process. You mentioned the work that reconnects and warm data. So all of these things all together provide framework or as a pathways, or how would you describe the relationship, I suppose, with warm data work that reconnects, deep ecology, and even permaculture, and how permaculture fits into all of this thinking around regenerative futures of ways to move forward?
Yeah, interesting you bring up John Seed. Like, I went to a deep ecology workshop that John Seed was holding in Sydney. I guess it was 2018, to really familiarise myself with the work of Joanna Macy to help with my own grief process. Yeah, and we have run so many Council of All Beings within XR, and with the lovely Frida, who was part of the Work That Reconnects community group. Frida and I ran quite a number of Council of All Beings together, and it just seems like, like if you're dealing with so much grief and people are so touched and moved by loss of species, it's nearly like before they can go to the inner work, like it's like nearly looking at the loss of species is so there at the edge that the Council of All Beings and speaking for the voice of a species is so powerful. And I think, coming back to your question about all these different type of methodologies, like if we are talking about the great unraveling, we're seeing systems changing on every single level. We're seeing these regenerative economics, like the work we're doing in Regen Sydney with donut economics, and which is also Brisbane and Melbourne and all over the place in Australia and all over the world. We're seeing people move into different types of regenerative farming. We're seeing, I know within the psychotherapeutic field, we're challenging the roots of psychotherapy coming from quite a patriarchal lineage. We're seeing the healing justice movement coming out of America with the Black queer femme trans that have traced back the origins actually of oppression on healing practices and peoples. So if you look up healing justice lineages, it's an incredible book that's talking about this. And I think, people are waking up every day to, like, they're just being oppressed, and there's a very few people on the planet just extracting and capitalizing and taking out the resources of beauty and for all the rest of us. And I think, quite frankly, people have had enough. And COVID was something that showed us a lot of real social issues that people are now, even coming out of COVID, just have had enough, and they're speaking up in their own ways. And these methodologies are able to get to new dimensions of information. And, like, this is where the arts come in. If you think about, the artists are able to access new dimensions of information. And then if we work interdisciplinary, if we work in these kind of groups that are really interested in multiple perspective and the cross-pollinations, the artists come up, surface this information, and then we've got the analysts that think about it, and then we've got the communicators that share it, and then we've got all these different people that unpack it in different ways and share it back into the system. That's what we're kind of seeing, these sort of feedback loops within planetary bounds of consciousness happening. And that's, permaculture working within a system that's able to sustain the resources. I think, I'm seeing, obviously you don't want to talk for everyone, and I tend to sometimes recognise I'm in a bubble of people, in these different communities that we're so hopeful, and then you can step out of it and it's business as usual. So I really want to sort of honour that that's the truth as well. But
I wanted to ask you a bit about that, because I worry about that a lot, because within our bubbles it feels like there's really great advances in terms of understanding and awareness and a movement for change, and then you just do sort of kind of pop out for a bit, and then you realize that actually things are just continuing, and I feel like there is this sort of mycelial web that's moving underneath that, and there is a changing. The unseen part is changing, like visibly it's still kind of looking the same, but there's something quite different going on. But I also feel like there's such a wave of a way that people are responding to groups, say like XR. There was and all the Greta's, the marches that were happening. There was a great big wave, and then it just kind of went in, and then there was sort of more of the attacks that you'd hear about, of that being a wrong approach, and then it would wave again. Where do you feel we are on this wave of awareness? What response are you seeing at the moment coming into XR, and is XR sort of shifting and changing how it's putting itself out into the world to respond to this changing dynamic?
Yeah, great question. And I have to say that XR is like a decentralized, non-hierarchical system. It's huge, and it happens all over the world. And I guess when a wave's happening somewhere, it's sort of like, this is the regenerative action cycle that I was talking about. Like, it may be, and it's also season dependent. Like, you can see that there's actions going on in the war, where it's sort of summer or warmer weather on the globe right now, and people have been organising over winter and coming out and doing it. And maybe in the context of the cooler, although there was actions in Melbourne recently, like, when people are sort of coming together and thinking about and strategizing what's working, what's not working. And something that, that all over XR there is a discussion is the protest laws. And it's something that we've seen last year significantly impact activists in their lives, and it's something that's being unpacked by law itself, and there's a lot of call out at the moment for the legal system itself and those making decisions, judges and jurors, and I think the conversation that I'm hearing within XR is like calling out the moral obligation, given the climate emergency, given the science. And yeah, so that's what I would say there. And as far as, within Extinction Rebellion, there's so many passionate people coming from so many places and spaces. And when you get passionate people coming together who have been oppressed often and coming together and haven't learnt deep anti-oppression values yet, or haven't learned about each other, but coming in under so much pressure to achieve a job, there's always going to be a mess at some part, and that's also part of it. We can put in the regenerative cultures aspects as much as we want, but people, we have to do the inner work to change. So as far as I can't speak for the whole system, but I in global support with Regen, we do have lots of dialogues with lots of the groups that are going through things and that we hear about all the time. And I would say waves are going up, waves are going down. People are strategizing here, sharing back in what's working. People are trying new things, but there's still people pouring into the system. Like, people are still pouring into XR and finding their place in there because they are compelled to do something. And something that I really appreciate about XR is that XR listens to the climate science. There's brilliant people on this planet who've been a climate scientist or, thinking about these things for a long time and are giving us this information. We base decisions around law and medicine on good science. And, it's perplexing to me that we're not doing immediate policy on the climate science being presented to us. It's just not rational by any means. And So when you get all these multiple perspectives coming in and unpacking this science together and then strategizing the way that they can communicate with that or protest that, that seems very reasonable to me.
So if there was 3 things that you would like to see change, what kind of shifts do you think are the most important that we need to be paying attention to right now, from your perspective? Because there are so many different perspectives, but where is the change?
It's a really big question, Morag, but I guess if it was up to me for 3 wishes, firstly, that the work of people like Mary Graham or Anne Polina would be highlighted, you know, and some of these incredible young First Nation activists that are speaking out. You know, Mary Graham's talk on relational ethos. If everyone would sit down and have a listen of what could be possible, we really need to know what's possible and then start thinking about how we can get there. Another thing is like doing the work of just deep compassion. I know we need to do the work of nonviolent direct action. We need to do the political work. We need to do all this work. But deep, deep compassion for the state of the world we're in, which means, you know, often the state that we can be in. And then how to recognize when we're in a state that actually needs care and nurturing, giving the system something so that it can step forward in its greatest potential, regardless of what's happening, you know, whether we're in bushfires or floods or, you know, like if groups can work and communities can work, recognizing that burnout, things like burnout, if someone shows up and they're burnt out, that's giving 100%. You know, if you've got to put someone on a mattress with a pillow, and that's giving at 100% contribution when you're burnt out, but still being part of it. So I think compassion and compassion for our beautiful native Australian animals and wildlife and fauna, flora. You know, I have a great love of dingoes, and if I could take down the dingo fence and show along with the other dingo advocates and permies like how biodiversity could do some healing with, you know, if we could take down such a structure like that and look at the wisdom of how dingoes organise and how they organise so well when they've got healthy social structures.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, you've lived with dingoes for a long time, and what lessons have you learned from your dingo life?
What I've learned mainly from living in relationship with dingoes is that it's like having a CT scan, the way that they look at you. There's no way that, you know, they're deep in relationship with you. It's not didactic. It's very somatic, and it's very deep love and generosity and playfulness, but they're on to everything. There's nowhere to hide. That's with a human sort of dingo relationship. They call you out constantly, but if you look at dingoes in the way that they interact together, you know, like, as I said before, if they have a healthy social structure where there's 2 alphas and the alpha and their territory, and they look at what resource is available on that territory to look after the pack. And often the alphas will be the ones that only have the puppies, and they may allow other, you know, females to have it if the resource is great, but they know how to be in relationship with place. And they know how to keep the biodiversity at such a healthy level. Yeah, their social structure, when it's healthy, is one of the best things that we could be doing for, you know, the continent of Australia, but the many, many countries that are on this large island of ours. You know, they're our apex predator. They're so wise, and, you know, that's what I know from dingoes, that healthy social structures reaches potential of environment.
And that's exactly what really Mary Graham was talking about. That's that relational ethos, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know?
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today about all the work that you're doing, the insights that brings, imagining those regenerative cultures. I mean, that's ongoing work, isn't it, wherever we are? And I think, too, there's something about valuing the local, and I wonder whether, just as a final comment about that, because sometimes when the issue is so enormous, so global, the feeling that it's not enough just to do this connection with place. I wonder whether you have any reflections on that, the scale of our connection, the scale of our action.
When I have felt at my greatest depths of despair, something that's helped me the most is listening to how people are caring for their place, like picturing in my mind, through that kind of systems thinking, that there's people caring for where they are all over the globe. That's what I love about XR, like people genuinely caring about their place. And if we did that all over the planet and, like keep expanding that into regenerative capabilities and potential, that's something where I can actually tap into hope, like that feels like authentic. We don't have control of what's going on over there, and we shouldn't have. We should be just in relationship. How's it going over there? What can we share?
Yeah, I really relate to that, and it's probably one of the reasons I love permaculture so much as well, because of that connectivity of people everywhere around the world having some kind of shared language, but deeply localized way of relating and connecting to place and to community. And I was saying that was the last question, but I have one more.
Yeah.
How, in your mind, how do you see the relationship between XR and permaculture?
Well, let's just talk about it. Maybe a direct project that you're involved in. Firstly, that we did meet through Warm Data, and that's been just an amazing community with Nora Bateson, but also like our project with the XR Seedling Network, where you've generously supporting a couple of activists, one from Western Australia and one from Kenya, to work on this permaculture project in relationship to XR, based on what country people are in. It's in some places, like particularly in Africa and Eastern Europe and other places, it's not safe to protest. I mean, you are murdered. You have to go with your options. And permaculture, call that practivism, I think you and I have talked about that before, is such a powerful tool of activism. Because we're talking here about people's well-being, we're talking about medicine, we're talking about being in life systems, and we're talking about beauty, and we're talking about creation, and they're pretty powerful life-enhancing things for people to be involved in. And once you get a taste of that, you just want more of it, and it can spread. And that's what we're seeing now with our beautiful Sam in Kenya, who's got this land that he's bringing back to life. They've got a well, and it's through doing this permaculture and then sharing it with all the other African communities, and then having this seedling network where people come in from all over the world. And I know you've facilitated some of those conversations a year or so ago, and we'll be doing some more. And it's just that, again, that cross-cultural, multiple perspective, people sharing is what's working, what's not working, but also that, like we said, knowing that someone's caretaking in that part of the planet gives you so much energy and so much like, wow, we're doing this together, and that can lift the potential, and that's kind of a regenerative capability. And that's how powerful permaculture is in its connection to Extinction Rebellion and to, communities across the globe.
Oh, thank you, Christie, for joining me today. And is there anywhere people can find out more, anything that you've written, or maybe the Regen Cultures booklet? Where would we send people to for that?
To find it? Yeah. Well, like I said, the Regen Cultures booklet was done during the fire, so we're very proud of the typos. But it's on ozrebellion.earth. You can find it under there. Sally Gillespie and Carol Wright and myself from Psychology for a Safe Climate just wrote a paper in the Australian Counselling Association journal on becoming a climate-aware practitioner. Otherwise, I'd really encourage people to come along to like a climate cafe, either within Extinction Rebellion Global Support. You can find that on the events page, or within Psychology for a Safe Climate. It's really great to come into those climate cafes there. I facilitate those with other practitioners, and you get to hear like incredible work people are doing all over Australia and global, but they're really a place to come in and talk about your feelings around what's happening. There's not the pressure to take an action or to, to have to do something there and then. It's that time for deep reflection and time for, just listening in, and the feedback is people just feel less isolated when they're able to have these conversations, and sometimes have to listen to perspectives that they don't share.
Thank you so much for that. That's wonderful.
I guess I also want to thank you, Morag. Like, you work so tirelessly in permaculture and with young people and with so many groups that don't have access, financial means or resources to do the permaculture, and you're so generous in that way. And it's always been a pleasure for me to have our conversations over the years, and your deep love of living systems and all the nerdy stuff we love talking about, but really also the life things, like talking about our daughters and our sons and, you know, the places that we love. So I'm just so grateful to have met you and for the work you're doing as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Sense Making the Changing World. Check out the show notes below to find a link to Christie's work, and also check the notes for where to find details of our permaculture courses, our YouTube, blog, free masterclasses and film clubs, and make sure you're signed up to hear our news and updates. And come and join us at the Permaculture Education Institute to learn practical skills for designing and teaching permaculture and making a good livelihood while living a permaculture-inspired one planet way of life. Until next time, take care. I hope to see you soon.